A very pleasant good afternoon to all of our viewers. We are delighted to have you with us on this very intriguing Let's Talk program. We trust that you are enjoying good health, that you are relaxed and ready for this very important discussion that we shall be engaged in. As indicated last week, we are talking about the Christian and performing arts. And we have a very special guest, but before I introduce our special guest, I want to just share a bit on what we have coming up. Well, first, let me indicate that this series that we're starting today is going to go into next week. So we will have part 2 coming up next week. And then last week, we had a very interesting discussion. Last week, we were talking about the whole matter of should I be rebaptized? And there were many questions relating to church membership, and we ended on someone asking a question about the term that was used was unbiblical marriages. I have gotten lots of feedback on that during the course of the week, and it may be necessary for us to deal. In fact, I did promise that based on the number of questions we had, that we're going to explore that particular issue, rebaptism, specifically relating to church discipline and how people re-enter the church. So perhaps on around about the 10th of July, we'll be talking about that. Hopefully later on this month, hopefully we are checking with our guests to make sure the availability, but we are hoping to have a very important discussion on the mark of the beast. And we're hoping to have another very important discussion on the whole matter of the third person of the Godhead, the person of the Holy Spirit. These seem to be some interesting theological topics these days. And on Let's Talk, as you know, we deal with any issue that surfaces. One other thing, a few weeks ago, perhaps a month or so ago, we had a guest out of Barbados. We had Miss Esther Selman, who helped us when we were dealing with the Adventist health message, and particularly as we were talking about plant-based proteins. And we did indicate then that she has a very special seminar coming up. That is tomorrow. The Caribbean Institute of Nutrition and Dietetics, they're having that special seminar tomorrow from 9 a.m. to 2 p.m. And I want to just encourage you to register for that. I'm going to try to put the link in the chat so that you can see it if you have not yet registered. Lots of persons have indicated their willingness, their excitement about the whole matter. But for now, this afternoon, we want to deal with the subject, the Christian and the performing arts. Before we go any further, we invite you to have a word of prayer. Father, be with us, grant us your peace, your grace, and your wisdom. May we have a blessed and a productive evening as we discuss in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. Today we have a very special guest. We have someone who I believe now resides in Michigan, in Bering Spring. He's a professor at the university there, Andrews University. And today he is going to be our special guest. And I want to, at this time, extend a very special welcome to our guest, Mr. Charles Reed. He is a performing artist. In fact, he's a tenor, I understand. I don't sing anything at all, but he's an international performer of operatic and concert repertoire. He has performed on many famous stages, and I'm just going to give you a sneak peek into some of the places and areas where he has performed. New York Metropolitan Opera, San Francisco Opera. He has performed in Frankfurt, Germany, in the National Heather Manil, the opera in Paris, Bastille. He has performed in several places around the world. a very outstanding and accomplished performer. We are just very delighted to have him with us this afternoon. He will share a little bit more about his exploits, but he is a professor of music at Andrews University, and he has kindly consented to be with us as we discuss this important subject of the Christian and the performing arts. Elder Reed, we are delighted to have you with us this afternoon. We have viewers from around the world, actually. Lots of people in the Caribbean who listen to us. We have people in Europe, in North America, in Canada. We have folks who listen in France even. So welcome, and just say a word of greeting to those who are listening.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me to talk about this topic. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's interesting that this is a difficult or a challenging topic, because as somebody who comes from the arts, we don't typically think of it in those terms. But I do know that among Adventists, it's something that has its own issues to consider. So.
Well, that's precisely why we are dealing with it on Let's Talk. You know, we try to provide a balanced perspective. We sometimes think outside the box. We want people to have a reason for their decision making. A lot of times we have individuals saying, don't do this, do this. But in this day and age, especially with the younger generation, folks are asking questions. They want to know, what is the reason for this, and is it really wrong? Should we not do this? Should we do this? So on Let's Talk, we discuss the difficult challenges, and challenging areas, sometimes the controversial topics. But we are just delighted to have you with us. And I want to begin by asking you to share a bit. You have, I started sharing some of the places you have performed as a performing artist. What is it like being a performing artist? And share a bit on your experience.
Well, obviously, my, I guess, entry into theater is through singing. So opera, if you don't know, is theater that's set to music. It's a kind of a precursor to what we think of as Broadway music theater shows today, and so I found myself called into this classical singing by God at a young age of 20 or so, and I didn't grow up Adventist. I grew up in the Southern Baptist Church, and so I didn't have the same I guess reluctance surrounding theater that many young Adventists grow up with. And I know that because they come to Andrews to study voice, and they've never thought about the possibility that they could be a performer in the theater. That's just not something that's a possibility in their thinking.
So you got into the theater. You have performed around the world. Do you have people saying, well, how could you be an Adventist and you're doing this? Do you get any pushback occasionally?
I met a couple. Most people don't feel that way. And maybe that's because they get to know me and they realize that my heart in singing is to use the talents that God has given me to just bless people through those talents wherever God opens those doors. And so that means that my whole life I've been singing and serving in church ministry, in addition to performing in the theater. And when I was younger, there was a singer named Steve Greene. Perhaps you know the name Steve Greene.
Yes, definitely.
And he was very popular at the time that I was figuring out where to go in life as a singer. And several people said to me, "Oh, you could be the next Steve Greene." I just didn't feel God. I mean, I prayed about it. I didn't feel God was calling me to be the next Steve Greene. And conversely, maybe you've heard the name David Phelps. We were in a choir together back in high school, and he really felt a calling to be the next Steve Greene, and he has gone on to do something like that. But I felt called to go into the classical arts, and that's ultimately where I went.
Now let's talk about the performing arts in general. When we say performing arts, what are we talking about exactly? There may be individuals who are listening who may be saying, "I have no clue about this subject." So what are we talking about? What's the spectrum of areas that we're covering?
Sure. So when I fill out my tax forms, I don't put opera singer, I put performing artist. And that's because it encompasses several areas of art that I perform in, including opera and oratorio and recitals and different types of things. But really, performing arts is a very generic, broad term. It could include any form of active theater, I guess. And instead of a painting, for example, is not a performing art. It's an art form that hangs on the wall, and a poem is one that rests in a book. But if it becomes read, that can all of a sudden turn into performing arts. And if you really, really want to stretch the definition, you could even go so far, and I'm not trying to be heretical or controversial in saying this, but you could go so far as to look at the art of preaching or hermeneutics as another form of performing arts. And again, I'm not trying to be controversial with that. It's just to say that it's the gift, or it's the working knowledge of how to communicate a story or a message through art. And that's how I would define performing arts.
Now, it's interesting that you said that, and we're going to come back to it in a little bit. But before we do that, how has your life work? How have you been able to use performing arts to enrich your contribution to the church? You indicated that you're pretty active in your church, and I know the other day when I was talking with you, you were preparing for a worship program at Andrews University, the Pioneer Memorial Church, I believe it is. So how has your life work as a performing artist impacted your church life?
Well, my whole life, my father in the Baptist church, my father was a minister of music, and we don't have so many ministers of music in the Adventist church as a traditional form of ministry. But I grew up around that with my father having that role. And I went on as a college student to also be a minister of music and youth pastor at a church, and sing in numerous denominations as a choral ringer in different choirs and things. And then once I became an Adventist, I've continued to be really active in music ministry within the Adventist church. I served as the minister of music for a startup church in Hoboken, New Jersey. Currently, I'm the worship coordinator for second service at Pioneer Memorial Church, in addition to my job at the university. And then there have been many other places, whether it be camp meetings or when I'm singing somewhere and attending a church, that I'll bring music and contribute wherever I can. So
now we are going to be talking about some specifics in later on in the program. Perhaps we're going to talk about theater. I'd like to get your definition of that, television, movies, and the like. But before we go there, let's zero in on the matter of performance. Earlier, you indicated that we could stretch the definition to talk about the whole matter of the art of preaching. I have here, I don't know that this can be seen too clearly, but I have here a book. It's called, well, my background is not making it so possible to see, but it's Performance in Preaching. I came across this as a reading assignment in one of my doctoral programs, and it was interesting. It's a very interesting perspective that the author, in fact, this is really several authors. It's edited by Jana Childers and Clinton Smith, but the perspective that one particular writer in this book shared is that you ought to see preaching as performance. Now, generally speaking, we tend to move away or shy away from the word performance because it suggests that we are in the entertainment business. And this is perhaps where lots of Seventh Adventists are challenged, the area of performance. But as I reflected on it, it appeared to me as though we really do perform. And performance can be, or should rather, be taken seriously. When you go into the pulpit to preach, you want to make sure you do your best for God. So that was an eye-opener for me. Not that you're going to entertain, but that you're going to share the word of God, and you want to be as effective as possible sharing the word of God. Now, that particular author shared about, he used the example of athletics. And he said, imagine a 100-meter runner. He goes out, he practices every day, he puts his everything into it, because on the day of the race, his concern is not so much entertaining the crowd. His concern is performing to the best of his ability so that he can accomplish his objective. And he was saying the preacher needs to be able to perform to the best of his ability to accomplish his objective of effectively sharing the word of God with his listeners. So from that perspective, talk to us a bit about the issue of performance and the importance of giving attention to performance in how we impact our audience.
Okay. Well, there's a lot in there. I guess let's start, if I may, with a basic definition of what art is. Okay, and this may differ for what a lot of Adventists have in mind when they think about art, but art in general is not entertainment. It may be entertaining, but its purpose is not entertainment. Okay, art is a reflection of society. Okay, and that's the best simple definition I could give. I would say that's also true oftentimes of preaching and theology, for example, that if you look at preaching from 100 years ago and you compare it to preaching from 50 years ago and compare it to today, you'll see people preaching about the issues in society at that time. Would you agree with that?
Yes, correct.
Okay, and art is the same way. Now, if the art happens to live on past its time, then directors might try to approach it in ways that make it relate, again, in relevant ways to society and where it is. But in a way, all art is initially conceived in a time capsule that reflects the society that it's in. Now,
if I may interrupt, you're going to go back to answering the question, but where do we? I follow you quite clearly, and it's an interesting perspective. I didn't really think of it in that light, to be honest with you, but it does make sense. But is there not a difference between art and so you can have still art? I can be an artist and I paint a picture, and performing art, because one is, well, I don't know. You're saying no. So tell me about that.
Well, I don't think so. I think there are time periods in the development of theater where you could look at it and say, okay, this wasn't exactly about deep topics. That's true. There are examples you can find where entertainment seems to be the goal more so than actually communicating an important message. Okay, but even within highly entertainment-driven art forms, performing art examples, you're still going to find messages. And if you think about what was going on at the time that those things were conceived, then you'll start to understand this reflection of society in the art. Okay, when you talked about communicating in a sermon, I think you used the word communicating. Well, no, you didn't use the word communicate. What was the word you used?
I'm not sure. I was talking about performance, and
but as
I
as
do
a
want, yes, communicate. I do want to be able to communicate my message effectively to my audience.
right. So when I think of in music ministry, when I sing in the church, I utilize all of the tools that I have cultivated in theater to communicate effectively and spread the message of the music I'm singing. I really do. I employ all the same tool sets. And it's not that I'm performing, that's not my goal, but my goal is to express the words and the music in such a way that they can be deeply heard and used. That people can engage with that information in praise, in something that changes them, in something that's meaningful. So communication is key. Entertainment is a scary word when we're talking about worship in particular, because yes, it would be wrong-headed to say that our worship should ever be about entertainment, but it must be engaging.
Well,
it must
is it?
be. I'm sorry?
I was going to ask you if, I mean, it is true that our aim may not be entertainment, but is anything wrong with entertainment?
Well, maybe we should use the word engaging instead of entertaining.
All right, I'll take that
as a fair way to approach that idea. If our worship services are putting us to sleep, or if whether it be the music or the preaching or the structure of how the service is put together, if these things are not engaging our interest, then we do have a problem, and that's because we're not, as a congregation, going to be fully present in the purpose of worshiping God. So, I think that it's critical that things be engaging. I know that preachers spend a lot of time thinking about how they will deliver a story, the timing of how they will say certain things, where they will pause for impact, so that the message has a chance to sink in, the order that they're going to arrange the information that they're delivering in the sermon. So the same kind of creative thinking goes into play when a playwright writes a story or a play. The same kinds of thinking go into account when a director sits down to guide a set of actors, or in my case, opera singers, to a complete a complete performance, the end result of all of these things. So in this way, we're all about communicating messages. And so the bigger questions might really be looking at the messages and asking whether or not the messages have place in the life of Christians, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Now you teach at Andrews University.
Yes.
And I want to think that your music students or whoever else enters your classroom, I'm not sure exactly. I know you're a professor of music, but this question may require you to go back to your classroom experience. There are lots of Seventh Adventists who are challenged with this concept of you mentioned just now, when a playwright sits down to write a plot line or story, and there are lots of people who believe that it is wrong to engage in dramatic presentations. They think it is not Christian. Some people even quote Ellen White in saying that she says we shouldn't do this or we shouldn't do that. So I'm going to ask you for a little history out of this whole matter of theater? First, perhaps you can explain or define theater, and then bring that to the discussion with respect to the reluctance of the church and maybe our understanding of what Ellen White said. Can you just attempt to deal with that for us?
Okay, well, there are a lot of questions there, but so, okay, art, we said, is a reflection of society. Theater, if we're going to focus specifically on that, is the telling of a story and the acting out the story. It usually will involve some sort of set and costumes. So people step into the shoes, so to speak, of a character, and they portray that character, and that's the role of the actor. But the actual role of theater then is to portray the whole story. So in other words, if you come to the theater and you come to see me perform somewhere, you're not coming to see Charles Reed, you're coming to see whoever I'm playing that night. Does that make sense?
Yes.
You're coming to see the character in the show. Now, that's a problem for a lot of Adventists, I have to say, especially on the campus of Andrews. And so, for example, I'll give you an example. We had an evening recital of semi-staged scenes, or I should say arias and duets from operas that students had worked up, and it was going along just fine. And then we got to the opera Samson and Delilah, and there was an aria in which Delilah is supposed to be seducing Samson, and there was no Samson on the stage. It was just Delilah. But between her singing and the way she looked at the imaginary Samson, it made some people seem very uncomfortable from the audience, and they talked to me afterwards about it, and there were two issues for them. One was that they saw this at Andrews, but the other was that they saw, instead of Delilah, they saw the person, and it was troubling for them to see that person being alluring. Well, another way of seeing that would be to say, bravo, she did a good job of actually representing Delilah. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And so what I asked in response was, well, if you go to the wellness center and you see the same person wearing remarkably less clothing and so forth, would that cause a problem? Or is it just, it's so in other words, the part of the problem was being able to suspend disbelief when you step into the theater and actually engage with the story being played out as characters. Now, I'm willing to suggest that many of the same people who may have been troubled at experiencing that at Andrews could go down the road to South Bend, to our theater in South Bend, and pay for a ticket to a Broadway musical and not think twice about much more risque, let's say, content. So maybe they wouldn't think twice about it because it just fits into the story and they don't know the people who are doing the story.
So let's get this, because it's interesting what you're saying there. The challenge, therefore, seems to be that the fact that it is on a Christian campus, then it's a challenge. But it's okay if it's outside the campus. If it's okay if it's been sponsored by a secular organization, but not a Christian institution. That's
They might think that way, yes.
Yeah, interesting.
And it was interesting to me that the one thing that caused conflict was a biblical story, also presented in a reasonably authentic way, and so if you really think about it, if you think about the Old Testament, and you just you ask yourself a thought experiment, what would the movie rating be on most stories that you come across in the Old Testament if they were to be fully fleshed out on this in the cinema or on the stage of the theater? What would the rating be? And you realize that there's a lot of there's a lot in the Old Testament of content which is jarring and violent and so on and so forth. And again, I'm not trying to say that obviously the purpose of these stories is to point us back to God and his character, but they're also human stories.
Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah. I just want to say that at the end of the day, most of what you encounter in theater is also human experience, human stories. And so the question is, where do those stories lead, or what do you take away from these stories?
I kind of wanted to just go back a little to the reaction of some of the folks at Andrews when you were engaged in that opera. Do you sense that some people have a challenge with the whole concept of drama, that maybe we shouldn't act out anything at all? Or is it just that particular scene, because of the seductive nature, they were thinking maybe it's R-rated and should not be done? Right. What really is it? Of course, your perspective.
I think for the vast majority of the people in our community here, the problem is not inherently theater. Okay. The problem really was that they just encountered something which made them feel uncomfortable at the Performing Arts Center at Andrews. It didn't take place at the church, by the way. It took place at the Performing Arts Center. And anyway, I think that it had more to do with that particular content. But on the other hand, we've had organizations that work up plays, perhaps from a Christian perspective. Drama has been a long time a thing in Christian youth groups, around at least in the United States of America, to have drama programs as part of a youth group ministry is not unheard of. Actually, my son, when he was young, when we lived in Hamburg, Pennsylvania, he took part in the annual play at Blue Mountain Academy, and that was a Christian play that somebody had written to communicate a message, and my son played one of the characters in that play because they needed a young boy. And so one thing, if you're a Christian and you're trying to figure out how can I be involved with the gifts that God's given me, and if I feel called into theater, one way that you can approach it is to say, well, I will create, or I'll be part of the creation of a new theater that is in keeping with the messages I want to promote, if that makes sense.
I want to stay with the discussion on theater for a little while.
Yeah.
Because you are into opera, which is theater, correct?
It is theater, yes.
Yes.
Music theater.
And when just for the benefit of all listeners again, because we are assuming that everybody understands what opera is. So maybe I should have asked you to explain what opera is. So you can go ahead and do that now.
Well, okay. Simple theater, it doesn't necessarily have music. And so one of the main differences between opera and theater, which is spoken, is time. in theater, the actor gets to decide how to pace the timing, just like a preacher gets to decide how to pace the timing of the delivery of the sermon. But in theater, in opera, you have music, and music determines the time, and that adds a whole nother dimension of control that you have as an actor. You have to figure out how to work with it, because you can't work against it, if that makes sense. And so that's part of the nature of music. But when you combine music and theater together, then you have the timing as the composer has conceived it, and then you have the direction as the director has envisioned it from the point of the director. And then you also have what you as an actor are bringing to the stage to create a synthesis of all these inputs. I'll be honest with you, I didn't have as great a sense of appreciation for directors until I came to Andrews and had to actually direct some musical productions. And I came to recognize how different everything looks when you're sitting in the room as opposed to sitting on the stage doing it. And how many little things you can see as a director that people on the stage cannot see because they're in it.
Interesting. Okay, so now that we have that concept and we appreciate it, let me go back to what I was asking now. So you as an opera singer, you essentially you are engaged in performances, and you are portraying messages, stories. You want to be able to communicate something to your audience. For example, when you were doing that Samson and Delilah scene, you were living the biblical experience, so to speak. Now,
the student was, yes.
Yes. Now, some persons, and again, because our audience is primarily Seventh Adventists, some Seventh Adventists are challenged because of the word. They grew up hearing. When I came into the church, I heard the theater is bad. So it's a bad place. So you don't make the distinction. This is an opera, this is a movie, that kind of, you don't make any distinction. You just say it's bad. React to that, please.
Well, first of all, so let's talk a little history there. First of all, Ellen White probably would have thought of opera as inherently, probably inherently bad, or communicating human instead of godly ideas. But more importantly, she would have thought of theater or opera as a waste of time. And so when I've researched into what Ellen White has written about opera in particular, because I was curious, obviously, as an opera singer, one of the things I discovered is she really didn't write very much about opera. In fact, she only wrote, I should actually pin it down to be a precise number, but I haven't. But she only wrote a few things about opera. Many of these things then were reprinted in other volumes of collections. And so it might seem, if you do a search that of her writings, that she wrote a whole lot about opera, but she didn't. And as far as I've been able to determine, there's no evidence that she ever, went to see an opera. But in Ellen White's day, the theater that would have been prevalent around her was called minstrel theater, and it was a type of theater that was popular after the end of slavery in the U.S. And it's where we get the term blackface. I'm sure everybody's heard of that. And this type of theater, this minstrel theater, was a popular thing in the U.S. for almost 100 years. And that's crazy to think about, but it was. And that theater included a lot of music by Stephen Foster, for example, and obviously the messaging of that time, of that music, was something which you could say was designed to spread ideas about Black people, specifically that they would be not so smart, or that they would be well, there are just a bunch of different types of ideas that might be expressed, which are not positive images, we would say today, which would be racist stereotypes. And that was part of that theater that would actually have been something she may have encountered, where she lived. And so that's important to understand what she might have been thinking about when she says theater. In its earliest roots, theater goes back to Greece. And so I don't know that we have any clear biblical examples of the term theater, but in Greek culture, theater was definitely a thing. It was used to tell the stories of the Greek gods and so forth. And in the early stages of opera, that was one of the topics of grand opera, was to look back to the understanding of theater as it was established in Greek culture. And so anyway, we move ahead to the mid 1800s, and Ellen White wasn't really exposed to opera. Broadway musicals did not exist yet. Movie theaters did not exist yet because there were no cameras. There were no, there was nothing to record on. There were not silent films yet. There, and that so as she goes later into her life, then silent films start to show up. Now, interestingly enough, I find this interesting. She writes a lot about not teaching your daughters to waste time practicing the piano. That was kind of a funny discovery. And in her time, if you were a young lady, then one of the things you could do to make yourself a good prospect as a future bride would be to play the piano well, so that you could entertain in the home of your family. And that was a thing during the time of the Romantic period. There was a thing during the time of Ellen White, was to do concerts at your home with a piano and singing and so forth. And she felt like it was more important to learn how to sew clothes so that you could serve others with that. But she also greatly valued excellent music and worship in actual worship services. And I think about James White and how he would start. It was recorded in this one book I read that he would start off like an evangelistic series, pounding on his Bible as he marched down the aisle, and he'd be singing, "We shall see the Lord a-comin'," and he would try to get he would use the energy of the music and the beat and the whole bit to rouse up the congregation to be excited about the return of Jesus.
Now you almost sound like you want to sing there, and maybe next week you can demonstrate some opera for us, or some singing. Sorry, I meant. But I want to go back a little bit. Now, you said a few things there that, to me, they're very captivating. But I want to go back to the blackface idea, the theater in Ellen White's early days, because, to be honest with you, we assume a lot of things. Without knowledge, we come to the wrong conclusion. This, I want to think, is a great revelation for lots of listeners. That in her era, what she was exposed to was a theatrical performance that was actually promoting racism, if I may say, something to that effect. Mm-hmm. That's rather revealing, because, I really never thought about that, to be honest with you. So that historical perspective is very, very interesting. And I can see clearly in that, from that perspective, why she would say, you know, I'm not going to encourage people to go to this, because that is not promoting the cause of Christ, so to speak.
And the Millerites and early Adventists were very much aligned with abolitionists, and so they were actively part of putting an end to slavery. But again, art reflects society, and the theater at that time tried to it used messaging to promote ideas that society thought were good, and at that time, and of course today we realize they're not good. And in fact, my wife is a music educator in the public schools, and there are now lists of over 100 songs that were once commonly taught in elementary music education as good songs that have now been basically stricken from the curriculum because of the roots and what those messages really were about.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
So now, I you know, it's what you're sharing is so engaging that the viewers are just commenting and not necessarily asking questions. But it's interesting, and I want to share a comment or two from those who are listening. Now, one person mentioned earlier that there's a running discussion, it appears, but I want to get to this one because earlier you made a comment. What is it? Hold on a second. Okay. We were talking about drama, and somebody commented the difference between, somebody's asking here rather, what is the difference between theater and motion picture? This is actually a question. What is the difference between theater and motion picture? Example, Hollywood, Bollywood, Nollywood, etc. So they're asking, is there a difference between that and theater?
I think in the simplest answer, you'd have to say no, they're all theater. Now, the medium has changed and the technology has changed. And so motion pictures obviously allow for the producer and the director to very heavily control everything that gets into the final production. Whereas in live theater, the actor is a loose cannon who has the chance to do exactly what they did in rehearsal or go off the rails and add in a lot of unexpected things because that's the nature of live theater. But I would say they're all theater. It's just a different medium. And I would also say it's important to recognize, and maybe this is another idea that would be interesting. It's important to recognize that I can do all of my research. So when I'm preparing a role, I research the historical background if it is a historical character, and I look at the music and I try to understand what was the composer trying to say with this music about these words at this moment. I try to really understand as best I can. And I look at the words just as a straight play, and I try to think, what is the meaning of these words? And where is this story going? Where is this moment going? I do a lot of research and I draw my own conclusions. And then I try my best to portray the story, the character, the message. I try to portray it with authenticity. But, and that's just my part. There's also the director and everybody else. But at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter what I think. I can say it means such and such. But what matters is what each member of the audience thinks. And that's where the perspective of the audience comes into play, because it is the viewer who gets to decide what it means. And that means that if you have 1,000 people watching the same thing, there could be 1,000 different nuanced understandings of what they just saw.
Yeah, I get you.
And so, when I sing Handel's Messiah, which is a great spiritual journey for me every time, okay? But I have to note that Handel's Messiah was not written for a worship service. It was written for the concert hall. And in a way, I have to say, therefore, it's not a sacred work, even though it's scripture through and through. Okay? But its purpose was not for a worship service. It's brilliant, and its theology is fantastic. But it was not written for a worship service.
Very interesting.
So it's theater, but it was written as an oratorio. Well, for those who don't know, oratorio was a theater without acting, usually of a biblical storyline, to be used during the season of Lent, because during the season of Lent, at a certain point in time, the Catholic Church said we shouldn't go to the theater during Lent, so they came up with oratorio.
Oh.
Okay, now, okay, so you have this work, Handel's Messiah. Maybe is that something that you've had the chance to hear?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
I love classical music.
And Handel's Messiah is amazing, right? But technically, it doesn't qualify as being written for sacred service. And when I am singing it, it is a spiritual journey for me as a performer, because I love the messages, I love the words, I love everything I'm getting to communicate. And I try to communicate it with as much emotional urgency as I can bring to the table. But for the audience, there will be people there who love it because they love music by Handel and they just think it's great music, but they may not be believers. And then there will be others who are there precisely because they're believers and they're looking for this nourishment from the words and the music. And then there's a broad spectrum, I'm sure, in and around that, of different perspectives that people bring to the table and then walk away from the performance. They'll come away with different ideas of what they experienced.
Now, it's very interesting that Handel's Messiah is not written as a spiritual exercise. Well,
I didn't say that. I said it wasn't written for a church service.
For church service. Well, sorry, let me put it that way. Yeah, you sit and you listen to the Hallelujah chorus or one of those others there. It is, one would never think about that. So that leads us to how do we take something that is, something that we're going to use in a church service that was not necessarily intended for church service. So we are looking therefore at the message that is being communicated.
Yes.
Not necessarily the purpose for which the thing was originally intended. I suppose that is an interesting perspective. Just something to take in. There is a comment earlier that I want to go back to. I'm noticing that we only have about 5 more minutes, but one person, while we were talking about drama and that kind of thing, one person said, I think the difference with drama and what's in the Bible, when we were talking about the Samson and Delilah thing there, is that the Bible is real. It happened, they said. Drama is an act. It's not happening. It's pretense. And then the person added, but I love drama anyhow. Well,
can I share a little story about that?
Sure.
Okay. I had, when I first got here, one of the first things we did was a dramatic performance of the Matthew Passion by Johann Sebastian Bach. And this I would actually classify as a sacred work because he composed several of these for use on Good Friday. at his church. But we staged it. We sang it in English. We translated it from the German into colloquial English. And it was a profound impact for everybody who saw it and for everybody who was in it. And one of those persons was in the choir, and he was not a music major, but he was in the choir, and he therefore ended up performing. And he was kind of blown away by the experience. And so he came back the next year, and he signed up as a music minor, which he could fit in to his remaining time. And then he signed up for we have a thing called the Singer Actor Studio, which is the group that we use to organize music theater at Andrews. And every time that would come around, he would sign up because he wanted to be in the music theater productions. And by music theater, that could include opera it's theatrical music or theater that is musical. Okay. Anyway, he was a pre-med student, and at the end of his time, he was getting ready to leave, and we were invited to bring some students to sing for some of the donors to Andrews University by the president of the university, and then they asked if the students could talk about their experiences, being music students. And so I didn't know what they would say, but this young man got up after singing and then said, I'm studying to be a doctor. And he said, I've become a much better person as a result of having been in these different musical plays that we've done, because it's forced me to walk in the shoes, and he described some of the characters he's walked in. It's forced me to experience somebody else's life and to learn to be empathetic. And he said, as a result, he was sure it was going to make him a better doctor because he had learned how to put himself in the shoes of another person.
Very interesting. I've heard of individuals who have acted, let's say, the role of a Bible character, and they were not Christians before, but they became so impressed with the whole matter of reliving the experience that they committed to God as a result. So that's amazing. Now I'm beginning to think, Elder, that we need a third week. We haven't really touched some areas yet, and our time is up. So I'm going to ask a question that we may not answer today, but we will answer next week, because the whole concept, there is some ongoing discussion in the chats about the whole matter of whether or not we should be using drama to assist in making clear the message of salvation. Can I, for example, go to church one Sabbath and sit and listen to a play, communicating the message rather than a preacher preaching the word, these kinds of things. And then we want to get to the matter of if I can go to Andrews and go to the Performing Arts Center and see the Passion of Christ, let's say, or some other dramatic presentation, or let's say the crucifixion story, or even the Samson and Delilah or David and Goliath story. Can I also go down the road to the South Bend or Benton Harbor Theater? I don't know if there's a theater in Benton Harbor, but can I go there and go to the theater there and also watch it? What is the difference? So we want to answer these questions next week. But next week, we also want to look at the whole issue of performance in terms of what can it do? Can more of our people get involved in writing, in creating music, in composing songs? And what does that mean for the church and for our young people and our expressions of what we really believe? So our time is up now, but we have a lot to explore next week, and we want to invite all of you to come back with us. As you know, this is a very intriguing discussion, And I want to thank Elder Reed for your time with us. For a moment, I was just carried away with what you have said and forgot I was on Let's Talk. And when I looked up, the time is up. So I want to remind you that, folks, that we're going to be back here next week at 3 p.m. Make sure you share the word and bring all of your young people, especially next week, to be engaged as we deal with some of these issues. I also want to put a plug for the Caribbean Institute of Nutrition and Dietetics. They're having their special seminar tomorrow. I did promise that I was going to put that in the chat, and I became so engrossed in the discussion that I completely forgot, and our time is almost up. But what you can do is to go to, just type in your browser Caribbean Institute of Nutrition and Dietetics, and you would see the information there. And once Sabbath is over, you can go and register and be in on that amazing seminar that is going to be really captivating. Elder, next week we're going to be back. Thank you again for your time, and may God bless you. Have a wonderful, wonderful afternoon, everyone.
And God bless you for the rest of the Sabbath too.
Sure. Bye-bye.